We want to smash, crash, bash, mash, blast the system. We want to get it hype, get it live, get with the mission. We want the crowd loud, this pumping rhythm is hitting. We want to make it clear, we ain't scared. This is the vision we want.
Welcome to the Project Censored Show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. On today's program, we welcome the celebrated Rolling Stone journalist, Matt Taibbi. We'll be talking about his new book, Hate Inc. Why today's media makes us despise one another. Part tirade, part confessional, Hate Inc. reveals that what most people think of as the news is in fact a twisted wing of the entertainment business. In the second half of today's program, we welcome back independent journalist and filmmaker Abby Martin. We'll be talking about her latest film, a full-length feature documentary, Gaza Fights For Freedom. Filmed during the height of the Great March of Return protest, it features exclusive footage of demonstrations where over 200 unarmed civilians have been killed by Israeli snipers since March 2018. That's up next on the Project Censored Show. Matt Taibbi and Abby Martin. Stay with us.
Unthinkable crimes perpetrated by the criminal minds, political ties, habitualized alibis, disguised under the guise of democracy, politics, and the apocalypse. Got the skies looking ominous.
Welcome to the Project Censored Show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. On today's program, we welcome journalist and author Matt Taibbi. He is primarily known for his work at Rolling Stone magazine, and he's reported on politics, media, finance, and sports. Matt Taibbi won the National Magazine Award for Commentary in 2008. He's authored several books, including Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus. Also, New York Times bestsellers, The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap, Griftopia, Bubble Machines, Vampire Squids, and the Long Con that is breaking America, and The Great Derangement, a terrifying true story of war, politics, and religion. Matt Taibbi, of course, is known for his work at Rolling Stone as contributing editor. He is also on with Katie Halper at the Rolling Stone podcast, Useful Idiots. Matt Taibbi also spent roughly a decade in the former Soviet Union, reporting for English language newspaper in Moscow called The Exile. Matt Taibbi's latest book is ever timely and certainly coincides with our themes here at the Project Censored Show. His latest book is Hate Inc. Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. Matt Taibbi, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Thanks for having me on, Mickey. I appreciate it.
We're greatly appreciative of your work and your analysis, and particularly in Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. Right out of the beginning, you list three significant influences. Well, I'd be seriously remiss to not note that the influence of your father, and you write eloquently about that in the book. But in terms of other public academics and authors and writers, you mentioned three significant influences that have shaped your work over the years. Could you talk at least briefly about that?
I've traveled around the world a lot in my career, and early in my career, I always had three books with me pretty much all the time. One of them was Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 72, which is Hunter Thompson's book, and I was very privileged to be able to write the introduction to the last edition. This is one of the great books about reporting, also about being obsessed with a story. It's a great book. Scoop, which is Evelyn Waugh's novel about foreign correspondence, which it's only really, really funny if you've actually done that job, because it gets to a lot of the absurdities of the work. And then the last one is Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, and they were academics. And this is kind of what Hate Inc. was originally intended to be, a rethink of that book, which was significantly about the unseen ways that Western journalism, specifically American journalism, is affected by propaganda and censorship. These are things that I've been carrying around and trying to be conscious of as I've been a reporter myself over the years.
That book came out in 1988, also was a pretty big influence on me early on and my trajectories. And Ed Herman, in fact, who passed away not too long ago, the last thing that he actually published was a 30-year retrospective on the propaganda model that we published in Censored 2018. After the monthly review piece, even, that he had done, which was, of course, looking at the absurdities of media fascination with Russia and so forth, which we'll obviously be getting into here in a little while, as that topic has not gone away. But in Hate Inc., you use definitely some of the propaganda model that they outline, and you talk about how that influences what goes on in the newsroom and in reporting overall. But also this book, it's written as periodical journalism. And you go back and you start looking at the 2016 election, what you call the beauty contest press coverage. And of course, later on, that morphs into the whole influence of worldwide wrestling entertainment. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen over the last decade media transform into this circus-like environment?
I'm now in my 5th presidential election covering for Rolling Stone. And when I first went out on this story in 2004, I remember the first couple of days I was out on the plane thinking that there's something really wrong with the whole atmosphere that I couldn't really put my finger on. I was relatively young and inexperienced and didn't really understand a lot of the dynamics of the story. And then over the years, as I spent a lot of time watching the coverage, I realized that a lot of what was going on in presidential campaign coverage is essentially it's a small sort of priesthood of reporters who work for the big newspapers and networks kind of colluding with each other informally to decide who is and is not an appropriate presidential candidate. And I would say pre-2016, pre-Donald Trump, voters really took a lot of cues about whom to vote for from reading campaign reports where you'd see the code words that they use, like this person looks presidential, this person is nuanced, or another person is quote-unquote pointed. They would lard these reports up with words that were either positive or negative, and that was how they told you that Dennis Kucinich was an inappropriate choice to vote for, while John Kerry was an appropriate choice. And I think one of the things that happened in 2016 is that voters rebelled against all that for the first time. The reporters, and I was in these groups, they were telling people in no uncertain terms that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both were inappropriate choices, but they just voted for them anyway. And it was a fascinating story to be part of, watching that dynamic over the years and realizing that reporters are really in a bubble and had spent too much time with each other and didn't realize how they were being perceived by their audiences. It was just fascinating.
There's a certain type of reporter, and as we've seen in professional journalism over the last couple decades, a vast percentage of these folks are upper middle class. They're mostly white male, and they bring these perspectives with them. And you quite effectively talk about, in your second chapter, you talk about 10 rules of hate, and also riff on Orwell's 2-minute hate issue. One really big thing to take away here, I think, is the mandatory binary framework that we see in the corporate media and how it fuels this great partisanship, siloed information that appeases confirmation bias.
It's fascinating, and it's fascinating there's so little pushback on this. If you turn on any television news program or open up the op-ed page of any major newspaper, you'll really only see 2 basic ideas represented. There's red and blue. And what intellectual diversity in a major commercial press outlet is basically representing the other party. If you're the New York Times, you might have Bret Stephens, or the Washington Post might have a Republican, like George Will to counter E.J. Dionne or whatever it is. But that's the framework. You're either left or right, Republican or Democrat. And this whole galaxy of other ideas is not represented. All the non-voters are not represented. People who are anarchists are just contrarian and dislike all the parties. They're just not there. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to train audiences to view everything through this binary lens. And we also want to train audiences to consume the news as sports. So we want you to root for one side or the other, essentially, because it creates kind of an entertainment subtext to all of the reporting. And this is what they did with Crossfire. It was a brilliant innovation. It was training people in the idea that there are these 2 ideas, they're always in conflict, they never come to an agreement, and you're going to root for one side or the other, and that's how you should watch the news. I think it's really insidious and narrowing, and people just aren't aware of it.
When that show first started on CNN, I remember watching it, and it was always interesting, the framing that went on. They would say, from the left, they would have like Michael Kinsley, some centrist, some corporate centrist figure, or Paul Begala later on, or what have you. And then from the right, it went everywhere from Bob Novak to the further far out Pat Buchanan, who later hijacked the Reform Party. So the whole frame of corporate media in that regard, in terms of legitimizing what the realm of myopic controversy is it's the pro-corporate neoliberal center versus the right to the very far right in terms of people like Pat Buchanan. And then that gets sold to the American public as, quote, news consumers, which implies we're not necessarily thinking critically about it. We're just shoving it in and moving on and regurgitating it later. But that kind of a frame, the impact that that's had, it's really helped push the political discourse to the right in the country over the last several decades. Not that it started with CNN, but I think that the advent of the 24/7 cable networks and then the getting away of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, Bill Clinton's Telecom Act of 1996 that further deregulated media, that paved the way for this top-down managed news propaganda that shifted everything to the right, that not only gave us George W. Bush, but a more centrist Obama, and of course now Donald Trump. So how do you see those things impacting where we are now in the current circus environment where you write about how everything is someone else's fault?
You're absolutely right. And that dynamic that you talk about, this milquetoast, unlikable centrist goof against a relentlessly attacking right-winger, it did have the effect of pushing people towards the right for a couple of reasons. Number one, the centrist never really stands for anything. If you watch these shows, the person who plays on the left is always this vacillating, ideologically insipid character who doesn't really have a center that's visible emotionally. You find yourself rooting for the person on the right because they at least have some guts and they're fighting and attacking and standing up for what they believe in. They don't have somebody who's up there with like a Bernie Sanders kind of an attitude fighting for the common person. That's not what you're seeing on TV. You're finding a beltway, centrist, corporate lawyer, basically, who's an unlikable figure. And I talked to people like Jeff Cohen, who played on the left on that show, and who was legitimately a progressive. And he was very frustrated because he wasn't allowed to really argue the way that they wanted him to, and he wasn't allowed to talk about important things. And it was the topic itself that kind of constrained him. And it has the effect of pushing audiences to think that the left, quote unquote, doesn't stand for anything because they don't in these shows.
No, in these shows, they surely don't. And naturally, and Jeff Cohen certainly went on, one of the co-founders of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Cohen went on to produce over at MSNBC later on in the early George W. Bush years on the Phil Donahue show. Cohen was basically told with Donahue, like for every anti-war person you have on the show, you've got to have 2 or 3 people to, quote, balance it out. This implicit bias that goes along with this, that if there's not 2 or 3 people on the right to attack one person in the center, there's just something wrong with the picture. But of course, what's wrong with the picture from perhaps our standpoint would be vastly different from what's going on with the average news consumer.
And this is something that Herman and Chomsky talked about in Manufacturing Consent. I would almost guarantee you that the people who said that to Cohen actually believed it, because what happens when you work in the business for a long period of time is that you get this kind of unspoken sense of what balance is and what's appropriate on the air. And it's not like anybody's telling you have to have 10 generals and CIA officials for every anti-war person. Actually, the ratio is much worse than that. It's more like 250 to 1 if you actually count it up. But you just feel that way. In other words, if you've been in the business for 20 years, you just get the sense, like, if I put one genuine anti-war activist on air, in order to cover myself, I got to have X, Y, and Z on the next 10 episodes. It's not commanded to you. You just get a sense over the years. And that's the way it is. Like, if you work in MSNBC, look at them today. Look at how many ex-CIA officials are on CNN and MSNBC. And I guarantee you the people who are making those hires think it's totally appropriate.
And you just quoted, and that's the way it is.
Right.
Going back to Walter Cronkite, you write about that in the book and how that's paving the way for what later becomes the we report, you decide facade of corporate media, where they actually decide what to report and then you basically consume it.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the whole Cronkite era. There were some good things about the model back in the day. Like, one of the things that was cool about the Cronkite broadcast is that sign-off was basically giving people permission to stop watching until the next day. And we don't have that anymore. Now, if you turn on cable, it's like you have to stay on the channel forever or else, like, your arms are going to fall off. Constantly giving you this message that the biggest thing in history is happening right now. Like with this impeachment story, similar to Russiagate, they're just blasting out this idea of an emergency at you all day long. I think it's very wearying for people to deal with because they just don't know what's important anymore. They're just stressed out more than anything else. But yeah, absolutely, that whole "we report, you decide" thing, it lulls people into thinking that they're looking at an objective presentation of reality when, of course, it's very carefully selected for them.
Yeah, and it's quite manufactured, riffing on the title of Herman and Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, going back to Walter Lippmann and Eddie Bernays, talking about how that's the way you govern modern democracies. This constant breaking news has actually arguably broken the news, and it's created this kind of outrage fatigue, which is a really huge concern. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind listeners, you're listening to the Project Censored Show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we have the great pleasure of welcoming author and journalist Matt Taibbi from the Rolling Stone, and we're talking about his latest book, Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. After this brief musical break, we'll continue our conversation with Matt Taibbi. Stay with us.
See, opinions are easier to swallow than facts. The grays instead of the whites and the blacks. If you shoot it too straight, they won't come back. We're selling the news. See, money speaks volumes louder than words. Or virtues with wings, maybe not quite at first, but salaries are paid by the ads, not the birds. We're selling the news. See, all men are equal, all is for sale. A powerful dog who's been chasing his tail. The lowest common denominator prevails. We're selling the news.
Welcome back to the Project Censored Show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. On today's program, we're focusing, surprise, again, on the media. And we're talking with the great American author and journalist, Matt Taibbi. His latest book is called Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. Matt Taibbi was recently in Berkeley, California for KPFA, so I hope listeners were able to get out and see him. We'll later in the year be playing some excerpts from that talk on our program. You can learn more at projectcensored.org. So, Matt Taibbi, you also talk in your new book, Hate Inc., about the tyranny of mediocrity, the church of averageness, and you riff on that for a couple of chapters. Can you talk about what you mean as far as that goes in terms of media?
Well, again, this gets back to something that Herman and Chomsky were talking about in their book, which is that censorship in America doesn't happen. There's no political commissar who wanders into the newsroom and red pencils your cop or asks that somebody be fired. It works in another way. Basically, if you're just the wrong kind of person, if you challenge your editors too much, if you push for certain kinds of stories too much, you'll develop a reputation for being a quote-unquote difficult personality, and you'll just wash out of the business, which is why you're always seeing stories of people like Chris Hedges being thrown out of organizations like the New York Times. And conversely, what happens is that they keep promoting people who are, in the book I call them C-minus brains, people who are kind of unquestioning and who are willing to be repeaters of ideas, because you do an awful lot of that once you get to the highest levels of this business. And so that's how you end up with these whole panels of people who just sort of always are predictable. On the op-ed pages, somehow, the biggest newspapers in the country, they don't have anybody who's really a good writer or who is witty. They have lots of Thomas Friedman types who speak in this almost like a salesman type vernacular, like I'm standing up against a bar and I'm telling you something I heard from somebody else. It's a pernicious thing. It's funny on the one hand, but on the other hand, all of these people rise up to this level precisely because they're good at not questioning things. And so that's how you have things like the WMD episode happen. Because even though it was preposterous at first blush and smart people saw through it immediately, none of those people were on the air, right? They sort of unhired people like Phil Donahue and even Jesse Ventura because you couldn't have people questioning what was going on. It's not like they're firing people who see through it. They're just not hiring them beforehand.
You mentioned a couple names, right? And even then, we couldn't have one or two even of these people presenting ideas on the alleged people's airwaves. You couldn't have any. If you had one, it could be a punching bag. But if it was somebody that was really articulate and had a long history and public respect, like a Phil Donahue with the brains of Jeff Cohen behind it, that was just too much. They just destroyed that program, and the corporate media trashed it. And, of course, that's early stages MSNBC. Let's use that as a bridge to MSNBC now. I'm sure we can riff a bit on how the news media stole from pro wrestling and what I'm now referring to, and I'm really glad that you wrote about not just people like Sean Hannity at Fox News, but you also included Rachel Maddow, MSNBC, right? The person that basically turned Russiagate into a cottage industry. Talk a little bit about the merging of the pro wrestling idea with what we get in terms of the endless gotcha but never get you reporting that Rachel Maddow seems to do on a nightly basis.
The news business, people have to recognize first and foremost that it's a consumer business like almost any other consumer business. It's a product. When you're watching the news or you're reading an article, just by giving your attention long enough to see an advertisement, you're participating in a consumer process in the same way that you are when you buy a candy bar or smoke a cigarette. What are they doing? What kind of business is it? Well, it's basically an entertainment business. They're trying to keep your attention. And they've borrowed from sports and from wrestling because wrestling is a brilliant formulation. It's a simple morality play of good versus evil. They hype up the evil character, the heel, and you're supposed to root against the heel constantly. And it's these staged confrontations over and over and over again. And the better the heel, the more tickets you sell. Fox was brilliant at this for years, and they made great villains out of Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and then later Obama. MSNBC now uses essentially the exact same format. They even drifted into the conspiratorial in the same way that Fox did over the years with this Russia story. And that's what I was trying to point out with the cover, which has Hannity juxtaposed with Rachel now, because the commercial formula is exactly the same. It's just constant, unrelenting stories about the evil of the Republicans and Trump and all the things that they're doing that should make you scared for your very future and for your kids. And it's not that I don't think Trump is bad, but he's not 100% of the things we need to worry about in the world. Yeah. That's what I was trying to say.
Nolan Higdon and I, in our latest book at City Lights, The United States of Distraction, we write about the phenomenon of Trump as a symptom of these problems while simultaneously trying to not focus on Trump. And we look around this, and of course we talk about Hannity and Maddow as sort of these two examples. And one of the things that I didn't know, you were talking about how you were on the campaign trail and you saw people carrying around a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf or Hofstadter's Paranoid Style in American Politics. The best line, you said, well, the book they should have been reading was Controversy Creates Cash by former wrestler and producer Eric Bischoff. And I didn't know Bischoff, and I didn't know this book, but you went on to say his book is a field guide to how wrestling uses provocation and fake narratives to drum up fan interest and make money. And I was like, bingo.
Absolutely. And it was funny because I know people are going to think this is a silly topic, the whole wrestling thing, but Trump was very into the WWE. He was in WrestleMania. He's good at it. He understands those crowds very well. But one of the things that happened when I started to see Trump, he's doing the classic wrestling heel act. In WWE, when the heel comes into the stadium, the first thing he does is he gets into the ring and he starts pointing at the crowd and saying, "Oh, you losers, I'm going to wreck your country." So Trump does exactly that. He points his fingers at the press and flexes and grimaces, and he's disgusting. But that gives him coverage on the one hand. And so when I started to see this and I realized that he was kind of doing this wrestling thing, I was reading about wrestling, but then I also realized an important point, which is that none of the reporters had ever watched wrestling. They were all Northeast Corridor liberals who grew up on baseball, and they not only don't understand the sport, they don't understand those crowds. Like, if you don't understand the WWE and NASCAR, how are you going to understand Trump voters? And I think that was an important thing. If you didn't understand the shtick, you also didn't understand the voters, and that was part of what was going on.
Yeah, and indeed, I grew up outside of Pittsburgh, and so I remember Steubenville wrestling, Ivan Putski, the Polish Hammer, the Iron Sheik. I remember all these characters, and it was writ large, and back then it was like the evil people in Iran. Oh, I'm sorry, we're still there. We haven't moved on from that narrative. Then that, of course, even infected its way into Hollywood with the Rocky movies and the propaganda against the Soviet Union and so on, and we're kind of in a Cold War redux here, and like I mentioned earlier, Rachel Maddow over MSNBC and a lot of the DNC, or MSDNC, the neoliberals in the Democratic Party, they keep flogging Russia, and it's gone from Russiagate to Ukrainegate to Impeachmentgate. I guess it's Scandalgate. It just keeps going on, and you aptly wrote that this Russiagate narrative is this generation's WMDs. Could you talk a little bit about that in the few minutes we have left?
Well, first of all, they're very similar stories. You could look back at the WMD story. It's essentially a story about manufactured, manipulated intelligence. So you have a similar character with Ahmad Chalabi, who is similar to Christopher Steele. You have this kind of faux whistleblower who is revealing the hidden truth, and then this gets funneled directly to a hand-picked group of reporters, bypassing the normal kind of fact-checking procedures within the intelligence agencies. And that's how all these legends got started about weapons of mass destruction. This exact same thing happened with Russiagate. People like John Brennan and James Clapper, it's hard to know exactly what happened, but we know on the reporting side what happened, which was that lots and lots of these puffed up, manufactured interpretations of things were spoon-fed to a small network of reporters who swallowed the legend. And this became fodder for 2 years of nonsense about an espionage conspiracy between the president of the United States and Russia that wasn't there. They somehow missed the fact that there was no factual basis for most of this. It was very frustrating to watch. It was disappointing to see that, in particular, the quote-unquote left-leaning media was so much worse on this than the other media. That was eye-opening for me.
It was definitely beyond disappointing, but I'd have to say that I wasn't surprised because I saw it coming with the DNC. You want to talk about collusion. There was definitely some work inside the party to squash Sanders. The corporate media did their greatest job to suppress Sanders and demonize Sanders, and we've basically picked up where that left off. Hillary Clinton firing the shots a week or two ago about how Jill Stein is a Russian asset and Tulsi Gabbard is being groomed by Putin. I mean, these are serious statements being made by career politicians, and Hillary Clinton, of course, seems to be mulling over whether or not she should enter into the race. I mean, the discourse is so completely absurd.
The fact that you even have to point out what's wrong with accusing somebody of being a Russian asset is dumbfounding. If you and I are the same age, we grew up in a time period where historically we were supposed to remember how bad McCarthyism was and how awful it was to impugn someone's patriotism without evidence, like how dangerous that was. There's a whole new generation that's coming up now that just does not have that sensibility. It's terrifying.
Indeed it is. I'd like to remind listeners we're speaking with author and journalist Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone. His latest book is Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. I strongly recommend you get a copy of this book. It's a fascinating and fantastic read. I think it's really important and extremely timely that it's out right now as we enter the ongoing circus of election 2020. Matt Taibbi, any last words you have here, particularly on what are you trying to get people to be doing here after they get a copy of your book? What are some things that we should be doing, do you think?
One thing that I realized in writing all this is that essentially this is a book about trying to raise consumer awareness about the news, and people don't realize, again, that they're participating in a consumer process. They still think the news is a public service. Well, commercial news media is a product, and it's manipulative, and it's bad for you in a way that a lot of other consumer products are. And I think people are already coming to this realization, but the first thing that you can do to break the cycle of all these manipulations is just to consume it less and to watch it less. Find some news sources that you trust, stick to those, and just don't watch cable, don't read a lot of these big commercial news organizations, because they've just gotten so bad that I think the process, people have become addicted to the negative cycle of this manipulative information. It's up to you. You can turn it off if you want to.
Here, Matt Taibbi. Again, couldn't agree more. We've been speaking with author and journalist Matt Taibbi. Also, check out the podcast he does with Katie Halper called Useful Idiots with Rolling Stone. His latest book is Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. Matt Taibbi, thanks so much for taking time with us on the Project Censored show.
Vicky, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
We've been speaking with journalist Matt Taibbi about his latest book, Hate Incorporated. After this brief musical break, we will welcome back to the program independent journalist and filmmaker Abby Martin of The Empire Files. We'll be talking to her about her premiere full-length documentary film, Gaza Fights For Freedom. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment of the program, we are honored and delighted to bring back Abby Martin. Abby Martin is an anti-imperial journalist, founder of Media Roots, MediaRoots.org. She's a former member of the board of directors at Media Freedom Foundation and Project Censored, and she is the creator of the Empire Files. And you can find out more information about Empire Files on YouTube. And today, Abby Martin is joining us to talk about a brand new feature-length documentary that she completed. It's called Gaza Fights for Freedom. And this is Abby Martin's first full feature-length documentary film, and she's been traveling around the country showing it. Abby Martin, welcome back to the Project Censored show.
Thanks so much for having me, Mickey. It's an honor to be on.
It's always fantastic to talk to you, and before we end the show today, of course, we'll be giving out a lot of information about where people can find out more about what you're doing with Empire Files. Just finished another documentary film with us on fighting fake news. But today, we're talking about Gaza Fights for Freedom, and the website is GazaFightsForFreedom.com, and you can learn more there. But Abby Martin, this took some time, of course, to make. So how did this come together, this collaboration that you've had with Empire Files and Gaza journalists in Palestine?
It was a labor of love indeed, Mickey, about 8 months of work that we took off from Empire Files. The story all starts from 2017 when Mike Preisner and I, my partner on the Empire Files and co-producer of the show, were in the occupied West Bank. Of course, this is an area that's under brutal martial law. You know, you can't convene in groups of 10 or more. You can't hold a Palestinian flag. Unemployment rates and imprisonment rates of young men are just skyrocketed. So we were pretty devastated by the reality on the ground there. We wanted to get into Gaza while we were there. You know, these are ongoing atrocities, a humanitarian crisis that's kind of unmatched anywhere in the world, that's sponsored $10 million with U.S. tax dollars every single day. We had all the proper credentials, filled out all the correct paperwork, and we were told by Netanyahu's underling from the Foreign Press Office that we were propagandists, denied outright and banned. I was also told not only was I a propagandist, but I was an Iranian agent. You know, here I was under the impression that I was a Russian and Venezuelan agent. So fast forward a year and a half later when the Great March of Return sparked off, and I was completely appalled by the corporate media coverage and distortion of the march. I mean, you know, the passive voice saying Palestinians died, clashes happened, instead of really calling it what it was, you know, an ongoing massacre of wanton executions and targeted assassinations of children, medics, press, and scores of civilians. So we had a Skype-in session with 30 Gaza journalists who were kind of using me as the liaison to say, you know, how is the Western media covering the march? Are they covering it differently than they do other things? And out of that Skype session arose a collaborative kind of pitch where we said, why don't we do something together on the Empire Files covering the Great March and doing the story justice, amplifying the voices that need to be heard that are completely obfuscated by the corporate media. And, you know, once we got the footage, once I directed these interviews and they field produced them, and we got back this brilliantly cinematically shot, slow motion, 5.1K, just incredible HD footage that was just stunning. We realized that we couldn't just put together an Empire Files episode. We had to really take the time, take 8 months off of our regular production and put together this feature-length film.
This is definitely one of the biggest censored stories that we've covered for years, the Israel-Palestine issue and the suppression of Palestine and the great human rights abuses that are going on there. You mentioned the Great March of Return going on since March of 2018. Could you tell people what that is that you're filming contextually?
This was filmed completely by Palestinian journalists, and I have to give credit to Muaz Mwaza and Ahmed Asma Atiya Hamad, the two videographers who shot all of the work and risked their lives every single week, literally running toward bullets to get the footage that you see on the film, and it's all exclusive evidence of war crimes being committed. The Great March of Return sparked off on March 30th, 2018. It was kind of the brainchild of a single Palestinian poet and activist named Ahmed Artema. And he basically just got inspired by the idea by seeing this fence that partitions him from the lands that they were expelled from 70 years ago. And he saw just birds flying freely between these lands, and he thought, why is it that birds can fly freely and we are deterred from traveling? I mean, this is the most basic human right, the freedom of mobility. And not only that, the freedom to live with dignity and also the freedom to protest. And so he had this idea that he posted on social media. He said, what would happen if we peacefully occupied, akin to Occupy Wall Street, these lands, this empty, vast land that stands between what we were ethnically cleansed from so long ago and call attention to the world, build international pressure to our plight as refugees and show people that we are still refugees 70 years now. And it just sparked off this incredible movement, Mickey. All stripes of Palestinian society, tens of thousands of Palestinians every week started to amass at this quote-unquote border fence. We know it's not a border fence. We know it's a militarized perimeter fence that was imposed. But that's how it all started. And of course, you can't negate the humanitarian conditions that led to this march as well. We're talking about an area of 2.2 million Palestinians, 75% of them are refugees, as I mentioned, because this was an area that quote-unquote criminals are just dumped. People who were basically expelled from the Nakba were all deported to Gaza. So this has been an area of kind of a warehouse of refugees for decades. And they're just collectively punished all the time. Israel controls the land, the borders, and the sea. You can't flee as refugees. I think it's the only place in the world where you literally can't flee by boat. Otherwise, you'll get shot out of the water by Israeli warships. The water is completely restricted. 97% of fresh water is toxic. 25% of all diseases in Gaza are directly caused by contaminated water. They live with 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. As someone in the documentary says, Ahmad Feroz, who we began the documentary with to just show what the average life is like in Gaza, he said electricity is as important as the air we breathe. And it really is. I mean, they're talking about pumping water to the roofs, keeping meat cold. And again, we know they keep Gazans on a diet, allowing the very minimal caloric intake to avoid malnutrition. So all of these factors together, and of course you have to understand that they just bomb them relentlessly.
It's been referred to as the world's largest open-air prison. This is just absolutely amazing that we have 24-hour, 7 days a week news coverage, billion-dollar industry in the United States, and we don't see any of these major corporate news networks even mentioning for 5 minutes these things that you just talked about. It's a riveting degree of censorship, I have to say. And the fact that you were banned from entering Gaza and then accused of being an agent of foreign states, that's a story in its own. That's another layer of this story, is that not only are these things happening, but anybody that's a messenger to try to tell the story is going to get shot. And some of these people literally are, and over 200 unarmed civilians have died at the border that you're talking about. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's what happened, Mickey, is that all of these people went with a mass civil disobedience action, completely nonviolent, bared chests, facing down a fortified military, right? And what happened is that they were met with sniper fire. Starting at 9 a.m., the first day of the Great March of Return, when tens of thousands of people went there unarmed, snipers started to open fire. They killed 18 people on the first day. And, you know, one international war correspondent that was interviewed for this UN report that we focus a lot of the film on talks about how this is different from other war zones of conflicts and clashes. I mean, this was a peaceful setting where sniper fire punctuated people dancing. You know, every 10 minutes you would hear a shot go off and someone else would fall. And there was a constant stream of bloodied bodies being carried back towards the ambulances that was really unlike anything she'd ever seen. And it really kind of shows you the barbarism that was involved in these targeted executions, because these snipers had a wide view of the demonstrations, and they were just picking people off every 10 minutes that were literally doing nothing. The UN report that was released this year on March 30th, 2019, talks about the egregious human rights violations that were committed, including just people standing there wrapped in a flag, people on their cell phones, people filming, children hiding behind a bin, and they were all shot in the head or torso, clearly murdered, Mickey. And that you know, that's aside from the Geneva Convention's violations that I can talk about. But, you know, the media has completely missed the boat here, and more cynically just totally censored this story. And when they have covered it, they've covered it as a both sides thing, and just also just excused Israeli war crimes to the degree of just shamelessness. The one day that was an egregious massacre, one of the most egregious massacres of unarmed people in modern history, May 14th, where 60 people were gunned down in cold blood, unarmed. 60. The front cover of the New York Times the next day said, "Israelis reflect. I hope every bullet was justified. And that really shows you the degree of how the media goes out of their way to absolve Israel from these atrocities.
It's another one of those, you said it, both sides. We get the false equivalency and the false balancing. And the frame here in the U.S., in the corporate press, even among some progressives, right? The moniker progressive except Palestine. It's pretty riveting that people, even though the UN and numerous nonprofits and so many independent journalists have been telling these stories for years, whether it's Nora Barrows-Friedman and people at Electronic Intifada, or you have covered this issue for years, and now you have this whole feature-length film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the examples that you gave about the New York Times? I don't think we can talk about that enough, really. I mean, and I want to definitely get back to the focus of this, which is the Palestinian people and their cause. But I think that most people in the United States have no clue what you're talking about in this film.
This is a massive political education effort. This is about media literacy and understanding what our privilege as American citizens and understanding what our government is doing in our name to sponsor these atrocities every single day. So this is crucial to understanding the media skew and the media construction of these propaganda narratives. And in the film, we show an unabated 5-minute section of a SOT montage, meaning a clip montage of all of the propaganda from Fox News to CNN, of the slick PR effort from the Israeli government. We call it a Hasbara machine. This is a multi-million-dollar propaganda effort that's put in to basically deploy Israeli officials that sound like you and me, right? They're speaking English, they look white. And this is on purpose. This is a direction to the American audience to brainwash us and to condition us to just accept this and to normalize this behavior. But they're deployed on corporate media to give these outrageous talking points to dehumanize Palestinians more than any other group on earth. We've used that human shield technique and that propaganda language to dehumanize every enemy of the U.S. empire going back to World War II, Korean War, Vietnam. You see this language being used when a massacre is about to be committed, right? They're all human shields, so if they die, that's why. They're all kind of robots being engineered, and they have no independent thought. They're just used by these enemies to sacrifice themselves. So it's nothing new, but it is used to such a ridiculous degree with Palestinians, where they're conflated with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and their fight and struggle is very unique. I mean, they're a colonized entity. They're oppressed. So to both sides, this argument is pretty outrageous. But yeah, the media montage that we show is absolutely astounding because it shows these Israeli officials just saying, blatantly lying through their teeth, not only calling them all human shields. I mean, you have these people on CNN with no interruption at all from these commentators and anchors. No one questioning their quote-unquote narratives whatsoever, these facts that they're presenting. They're saying they're paid to get shot, paid $500 per gunshot wound, one of the Israeli officials says. They just blatantly deny the fact that people in wheelchairs were gunned down, children were gunned down. They say that if kids were shot, it's because Hamas threw them in the line of fire. And then you have Netanyahu himself saying they're used as telegenically dead, saying that Palestinians actually sacrifice their own so they can look good dead on TV, piled up dead bodies. Then he says they're committing massive self-genocide. I mean, can you think of anywhere else in the world you could actually use that language and say they're doing this to themselves? We're not committing genocide against them. They're committing genocide against themselves.
This is amazing Orwellian propaganda. It's just riveting. It just shows when you see this kind of footage back to back, it really gives people an opportunity to start thinking critically about the media that they're watching and the stories that they're not being told. I'd like to remind listeners you're tuned to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. We are honored to once again have back on the program independent journalist Abby Martin. She's an anti-imperialist journalist, founder of MediaRoots.org. She's worked with us at Project Censored over the years and, of course, is the creator of the Empire Files. Abby Martin also wrote a stellar foreword for us at Project Censored in Censored 2019, Fighting the Fake News Invasion. And she also has just completed a fake news documentary with us. But today we're talking with Abby Martin about her latest film. It's her first full-length feature documentary film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. And we're going to continue that conversation with Abby Martin after this brief musical break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. On today's program, we're speaking with journalist and documentary filmmaker Abby Martin. She's the founder of MediaRoots.org and also has worked with us at Project Censored for many years, formerly on our board at Media Freedom Foundation. She is also creator of the Empire Files and her latest film, Gaza Fights For Freedom. You can learn more about it at GazaFightsForFreedom.com. MediaRoots.org. And Abby Martin, give out a couple of other sites for people to catch your work.
You can check out the full-length film on Vimeo. Right now, if you have a smart TV, we recommend watching it on that. The Empire Files, Gaza Fights For Freedom movie, you can download it or rent it. You can also purchase the DVD on our empirefiles.tv website, GazaFightsForFreedom.com. The DVD pre-sale is now up for purchase. And also just follow us on Twitter at the Empire Files social media and subscribe on the Empire Files on YouTube.
Absolutely. And Abby Martin, let's get back into this. You just completed a fairly extensive tour. You were in San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Toronto, Montreal, and of course, other people can host screenings at the website, GazaFightsForFreedom.com. We're certainly going to be showing the film back here in the Bay Area. Very important film. For those of you just joining us, we're again speaking with journalist and filmmaker Abby Martin, and we're talking about her film, Gaza Fights For Freedom. So before the break, Abby, you were giving us a rundown on how significant and grotesque, in fact, the propaganda and doublespeak and so forth is around the issues in Gaza. And you mentioned, of course, that Hamas comes into play in terms of people blaming, as you mentioned, people like Netanyahu saying that the Palestinians were committing self-genocide. Just absolutely preposterous. But could you talk to us about some of the other international political situations that are there regarding the region, Hamas, Iran, Syria, etc., because you've brought up a couple of these things, including the fact that at one point you were accused of being some kind of Iranian agent.
Right. I mean, it's important to remember that Gaza is regarded as a hostile territory. We hear about this Russian meddling in our elections. It's important to remember, according to WikiLeaks cables, meanwhile Julian Assange is languishing in prison, that WikiLeaks cables revealed that Israel meddled in Gaza's elections in 2005 or 2006 when they had their first democratic election when Hamas actually won. The year prior, Israel was kicked out. They were brutally militarily occupying Gaza the same way that they're continuing to occupy the West Bank back then. So they were kicked out because of resistance, pretty militant resistance there. And so they wanted to collectively punish Gaza moving forward, but they intervened, worked with Fatah to make sure that Hamas won. And they made sure Hamas won so they could regard the entire region as a hostile entity. If you go back after the Nakba, declassified Israeli military documents that we actually uncovered from Ilan Pappé that were shown for the first time in this film, showing that they actually had a shoot-to-kill order back then regarding anyone who was deported from the Nakba as infiltrators. And so this shoot-to-kill authorization that's still in place with these no-go zones on the Gaza quote-unquote border is a policy that's always been in place. And the justification has just changed. The language has morphed. First it was infiltrators, now it's terrorists, Hamas militants. It's comical to actually paint 2.2 million people of extreme political diversity. I mean, Gaza is like any other place. There's a mosaic of political factions that live inside of this area. The PFLP, the Communist Party, is actually the second biggest party there. They are very radical leftists. There's also Fatah, Hamas's rival. There's people who are actually more right-wing than Hamas, the Islamic Jihad. So there's a mosaic of political factions there. And all of these factions, these political parties, were involved in the Great March of Return. But also the Great March of Return was primarily led by unaffiliated academics, scholars, artists, and musicians. And it started off as a festive occasion until they had a massacre committed against them, which is still ongoing. It's important to remember this march has still been going on for the last year and a half. Every single Friday, there are these wanton executions taking place from against unarmed protesters. So I always think it's funny when people paint the entire region as Hamas, and you just hear this rhetoric being used ad nauseum, and it's like, this is not at all what's going on the ground. It's just continued to use as a justification to when 2,200 Palestinians are bombed, 500 children dead, like what happened in 2014, you can just chalk it up to say, well, they're all Hamas. And I remember at RT when I was reporting during Operation Pillar of Cloud, when Israeli officials bombed the journalist tower, the Al Sharouk journalist tower, and blew an RT cameraman's leg off. And RT formally requested, what the hell happened? Why did this happen? And they said, sorry, everyone in Gaza is a Hamas target. The actual IDF spokesperson said that to RT, and they said, RT's taken a side in the coverage. And that's when I realized the extent that the Israeli military would go, that really everyone can be a target that's in Gaza, and it doesn't matter who you are, who you're affiliated with.
Right there is a pretty amazing situation about which people in the United States are grossly ignorant. The degree of media illiteracy, the degree of global political illiteracy in the United States is riveting. The percentage that the major news networks spend on foreign news is abysmal. And when they do spend time on it, it's straight up propaganda, often sounding like PR reports from the Pentagon or the State Department. Just to turn momentarily to the U.S. and the U.S. political establishment, given that there is resistance perhaps in Israel, but it doesn't get a lot of play either. And of course, that's not the prevailing view in Israel, right, regarding Gaza and freeing Palestine. In the United States, even, we hear Israel a lot. And Israel also had influenced the elections in the United States. And there's evidence that they had meddling involved here in the United States, but we never hear about that. We hear about Russia. Anybody on the playing field here in the 2020 circus mentioning anything happening in Palestine? Is any of that on your radar at all?
First, I want to address the inner politics of Israel, because I think it's important to address this notion that a two-state solution is possible and that there's a left within Israel that's pushing the government away from this fascistic bent that it's been taking for the last decade or so with the Netanyahu administration. And I think it's pretty obvious when you look at polls reflected across Israeli society. 85% of Israelis agree with the open fire policy against Gaza protesters unarmed. Some human rights activists tried to actually protest this, take it to the Supreme Court or the Knesset, and protest this open fire policy, and they were unanimously denied. We saw the Arab seats, the few Arab seats that exist in the Knesset, actually temporarily banned. The very few that are calling to end the siege and occupation temporarily banned from the Knesset. But I think that lifted the facade a little too much. The latest election was essentially between Trump and Gantz, who everyone says is quote-unquote the liberal left, which I find a shocking declaration, is a war criminal. I mean, he's killed scores of civilians, led carpet bombings of neighborhoods, and also said, when Netanyahu declared that he wanted to annex the West Bank, he said, thanks for coming along to my policy that I've been advocating for years. So is he really left? Is this really a liberal navigation that we're taking off the Israeli political spectrum, or is this more of the same? So I think it's really important to understand that there is no hope from within Israeli society, not to say that there's not anti-Zionist Israelis fighting, but there's not enough of them to change where the course is going, which is increasingly fascistic. And people are dying every day, and this violence is taking place every day. Meanwhile, U.S. politicians still talk out of both sides of their mouth about a two-state solution. There is no second state. The West Bank is completely atomized. That's what the so-called second state would be. So that is atomized by settlements that have increased hundreds of percentages under Trump. The settler terrorism has increased 300%. It is unbelievable what is escalating under the Trump administration, who Netanyahu has declared is their best friend out of all U.S. presidents. So he has really given a green light to this violence and increased annexation of the West Bank to a level we haven't seen before. Now, you look at the political spectrum of Democratic contenders, there is something to say about the fact that things are changing rapidly. And I think it's because of the violence and massacres that Israel is perpetrating. And I think it's because of the fact that Palestinians are filming this themselves, that Americans are finally waking up, seeing on social media the narrative is not tightly controlled. The record is not being corrected as tightly as it used to be from the Hasbara operation, because Palestinians are able to speak for themselves and tell Americans, finally, this is what's happening to us. And with the advent of social media and citizen journalism, that's happening more and more. So you see polls reflected in this with Democrats and Republicans alike. Support for Israel is shifting dramatically. And the pressure that is mounting on the ground, whether it be Jewish Voices for Peace, whether it be people walking off birthright trips, politicians are responding to this. Bernie Sanders, who was actually terrible on this issue a couple of years ago, is coming out there now the only contender actually daring to humanize Palestinians, talking about leveraging aid, stopping all aid to Israel unless the occupation ends, the siege is lifted. So that's something that I find really positive. I think that someone like Bernie Sanders can be moved with the political masses behind him. But I think it's important to also recognize, and, aside from that, all of the other Democratic contenders are horrible on this issue. Elizabeth Warren is atrocious. Everyone is a sycophantic lackey for Israel, and that has not changed at all, despite the fact that the masses are waking up to this and advocating BDS like never before, and around the world, too. But I think that there is no savior 2020, Mickey. I think that even if Trump does win a second term, we can still win on this issue because no president has ever been moved from the top down. It's always been the masses mobilizing a huge movement. And that's why it's up to us to really resurrect an anti-war movement in this country, linking these struggles together, linking the fact that Black Lives Matter, police are trained by the Israeli military, the fact that kids are being caged at the border by Israeli military technology. If we start linking these struggles together with an internationalist lens, understanding what our government is doing in our name, it's up to us to use our privilege as Americans to galvanize each other, build the momentum and the pressure against our government. So there is no choice. There is no choice but to isolate Israel. And that's what's happening all around the world. That's what's happening with BDS. That's why they're so terrified of BDS everywhere. Ireland unanimously passing a BDS resolution. Britain, trade unionists, unanimously passing BDS resolutions. We have a couple sitting congresswomen who are advocating this as well, and that is a huge shift, Mickey.
Abby Martin, as always, your work in Gaza Fights for Freedom does what investigative journalism and documentary filmmaking is supposed to do, shines the light in the dark places. And again, it's a great human rights tragedy that's taking place here, and I encourage people to see the movie Gaza Fights for Freedom. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks so much for your work, Abby Martin.
Supporting human conditions, not free market propaganda and corrupt politicians, cause they owned by special interest groups that fund their campaign. That's why you hear the same old things they claim, but change never came. It's a dirty game maintained by rain for capital gain.
You've been listening to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. My occasional co-host is Chase Palmieri. We founded this program with Peter Phillips back in 2010. We're on roughly 50 stations around the U.S. from Maui to New York. Our senior producer is Anthony Fest. Our associate producer is Dennis Murphy. To learn more about the Project Censored Show and our work, go online to projectcensored.org. Please follow and like us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And be sure to contact us if you have nominated stories that are unreported or ideas for the program. Again, I'm Mickey Huff signing off for the Project Censored Show. We'll see you next time.
Unthinkable crimes perpetrated by the criminal minds, political ties, habitualized alibis, disguised under the guise of democracy, politics, and the apocalypse. Got the skies looking ominous. So the ocean burned bright with waves full of poison. Genocide wars fought for little boys, and the weapons manufactured paid for by taxing while the bridges and the levees and the mines collapsing. All the prisons build the capacity citizens. And the times for the master thief, combine and conquer, steal a masterpiece. Open your eyes and realize what's happening. Time's running out to reach all potential. If you ain't at the table, then you're probably on the menu. We got that love, we live the